Hello. Not sure if that was working. All right. Today we're going to be talking about evolution. First off, what is evolution? Evolution is a change in gene frequency. So we're looking at evolution. We're looking at a change in the genes, not just an overall, oh man, that species turned into a new species. We're talking all that has to happen is the species genes have to change just enough to make it significant. So let's move on. And today we're going to be talking about Charles Darwin and what he did. Now, first, you need to know a few things about who influenced him and him in general. So, Darwin was the son of a doctor, which means he had one of the best educations that England could offer at the time, back in the early 1800s. And so he was able to just study anybody and everybody that he possibly could to learn everything he did. Now, one of the people he did study was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was a French scientist that kind of came up with this thing called use versus disuse. It's a little principle. That's the word I was looking for. This little principle called use versus disuse. Now, what Lamarck said was, if you use it, you'll keep it and pass it on to your kids. It'll get passed on to your kids. If you don't use it, you'll lose it, so it won't get passed on to your kids. But the problem with what Lamarck said was that a giraffe's neck just keeps stretching out, and it'll pass on that stretched out neck to its kids. That's like saying cutting off a rat's tail and that all the other rats won't have tails because the parent rat didn't have a tail. Or I cut off my arm and my kids are going to be born without an arm. So he got ridiculed and pretty much rejected by science after that. But his use versus disuse was very helpful for Darwin, because he did see that in nature where one trait is used more often than the other one. And so that's the one that the population it'll choose that trait over another one. So he did use Jean-Baptiste Lamarck for that. Now, he was influenced as well by this man named Alfred Wallace, who was over in New Guinea and the Ghanaian Islands and stuff over there on the eastern side of the world, who was studying natural selection as well. And so him and Darwin were able to discuss things through letters, and I think they got together a few times too to kind of discuss their ideas about natural selection. So they worked together, and Alfred Wallace just kind of backed Darwin up with his theory of natural selection. Now, Darwin loved geology, and he studied this principle called uniformitarianism, which is whatever happened back in the day, back then, what happens back then happens now. So, if we're looking at sedimentary rocks, sediment will, flow down a river. If it did that back then, and it deposited at the end or deposited on the sides and rock was formed millions of years ago, it will happen now as well. And this was a principle, and it's now a law, by Charles Lyell, a geologist. And this really affected Darwin, because he's looking at fossils and things going, oh, well, if it happened back then, if evolution happened back then and nature was selecting for traits back then it must be happening now. So, pretty interesting. The last guy he talked about was Thomas Malthus, that influenced him. Malthus was a population dynamics person. He also studied finances and things like that. So, he was just a numbers guy. And he looked at, well, if you have enough resources, then the population can grow. And if you don't have enough resources, then the population won't grow as much. There's going to be more competition with less resources and more individuals. And Darwin looks at that and goes, well, that's true of almost every species on the planet. So this helped him as well kind of form his theory and the things he talked about. So Charles Darwin, he actually published his book on the origin of species in 1859. That was the year he published. Now, he did his research and everything started back in the 1820s, but he was really nervous to publish because of the religious climate back in the day and what they did with Galileo, put him under house arrest for kind of opposing their authority. It wasn't that they opposed his research per se, it's that he opposed their authority. And so Yeah. He and then took 300 years for people to accept that we have the heliocentric model in our universe and in our solar system. So right now we're what 150, 160 years in, and people are still opposing natural selection and the theory of evolution. So Charles Darwin was really nervous to publish his stuff, but let's talk a little bit about what happened and why he did what he did. So Charles Darwin was actually a theologist, so he studied religion and he studied science. He loved science, but he really wanted to go on this voyage, but he wasn't sure because he wanted to be, you guessed it, a priest. He wanted to be a priest for his church. And so he ended up talking to his priest about whether he should go or not. And the priest told him, well, if you go and you can figure out if you want to do the science thing or come be a priest, because the clergy will still be open for you if you want to do that. And so he went on the voyage. It's supposed to be 2 years. It's supposed to follow this red line right here and then come to here and come back. They were just going to map out the coastline of South America for England. Well, Darwin, this being the scientist he is, decided to study a bunch of the creatures and everything. And when he got to the Galapagos Islands, he noticed these finches. And these finches, they all had a different beak. If you look at that beak, so some of their beaks had that kind of pattern like this. And then he looked at some others, and they were more like pointy. Notice the others looked like this, but they all look like the same species of finch. So he's going, wait a second. And they're all on separate islands. And he noticed that it was based on the food that they ate, that was the reason why they were different. And he goes, these all look so similar, they must be related somehow. Now remember, he grew up believing that the creation is the only thing that there ever was in his religion, and that's totally fine. But he's noticing these other things, going, wait a second, I'm making these observations, and he had to change his mind about a few things. Okay, the species can change. That's what he had to change his mind about, that a species can change. It doesn't have to stay set in the way that it is. And so, based on its resources, it's going to change. And, that wasn't hard for him to change his mind about that. His beliefs about species being able to change based on their resources. That was pretty easy for him. And so Darwin took this journey, learned a lot about different species, and he came up with 6 major points that helped him explain his theory of natural selection. His first major point, he said, was overproduction. So all of these melons that, they all have seeds inside of them. They're not all going to be planted in the ground, and they're not all going to reproduce. So he said with any population, there's overproduction. There's too many individuals that not all of them can survive and reproduce, which leads to there being variation within that population. So I love this picture. It shows all these different fur coats of giraffes. It really kind of helps illustrate that every species has variation within that species. And so it causes variety, which creates competition for resources. That's his third major point, is there's competition for resources. And, this is a competition for resources, a competition for money, for pride, things like that. So humans compete, cacti compete, all that kind of stuff. They all compete for resources, water, food, money, that kind of stuff. So if you compete and you have the best trait to survive in that environment, you will survive. And he called that survival of the fittest. So the fittest will survive. So this zebra must be one of the slower zebras out of all of them. So it is not fittest to survive. It doesn't have the best trait to survive in its environment because the lioness is going to catch it. Now, if you survive and you have the fittest traits, you will reproduce and pass on those traits to other people. So I put the seeds on here because those are plant babies, plant eggs, pretty much. So yeah, when you eat, seeds or nuts, you're eating, plant babies. So just so you know. Okay, cute puppies. Okay, so you got to reproduce and pass on those superior traits for their environment. That doesn't mean they're the best traits. It just means it's the best for that environment. So, as you can see in this left picture right here, this left one, the ancestor finch natural selection happened, and you had insect-eating beaks, you had woodpecker beaks for insect eating, and you had seed eating beaks. So all these things kind of influenced Darwin, and he goes, well, they must be becoming different species. He called that speciation. So what he said was humans, gorillas, and chimpanzees all have a common ancestor with each other. Where they split off, gorillas went off this way, chimpanzees evolved more with humans, but then they split off, and humans kept evolving to have bigger brains and things like that, have better traits, for thinking and creating and things like that. So he said we have a common ancestor with them. He never said we actually come from apes. He said we have a common ancestor with apes because we are part of the apes. So speciation is where one species will be isolated from another one and it'll become a different species. So that I will cover in our next video. All right.